Think your dating life is awkward? Imagine your entire love fate decided by a ledger, a goat, and a man in a collar taking notes. No swiping, no group chats, no awkward first dates in coffee shops. In much of medieval Europe, romantic choice as we understand it today was hardly the default. Instead, courtship often looked like a negotiation. Families, landlords, priests, and the community all had votes. And yet people loved, coveted, flirted, and schemed just with a different vocabulary. By the end of this video, you'll know how someone sent a message with a glove, why a carved wooden spoon could be a proposal, and why courtly poets made romance into performance art. You'll see that dating existed, but not as a private, casual pastime. It was public, material, and full of theatrical rules. Stick around, because the surprises are less about the absence of love and more about the way love behaved. If you love weird, surprising history, hit subscribe and tell us where you're watching from, city, country, or your closest medieval reenactor meetup. So, who actually chose who? The answer depends a lot on whether you or your family owned land. Let's step into two very different mornings. One, a candlelight chamber in a manor house, stone walls buzzing with whispered alliances. Another, a thatched cottage with a newborn lamb bawling outside, smoke curling from the hearth. Both scenes are about more than feeling. They're about survival, property, and reputation. Those practical pressures shaped how people flirted, what tokens meant, and who could refuse an offer. But they didn't crush tenderness. Instead, they braided affection into other obligations, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally. Nobles and betrothal, marriage as diplomacy. Picture a long table, guests in velvet, lords trading favors like merchants swapping bolts of cloth. For nobles, marriage was often diplomacy. Families used marriages to secure peace, consolidate land, and align claims. Children could be betrothed young. Sometimes infants were promised to one another in formal ceremonies that bound families long before the couple ever exchanged a kiss. Betrothal could be legally significant. Again, across medieval Europe, practices varied. So when I say binding, please read that as often legally and socially significant in many places, indeterminate in some regions. For an aristocratic young woman, and I'll use a fictional example, Lady Marjorie, a name you might imagine carved into a manuscript, marriage meant managing a dowry, goods, money, or land given to secure the match and to provide for household management. A dowry wasn't simply a romantic token. It was a resource, a starter kit for running an estate, linens, livestock, silver, rights to tenancies. The groom's family might offer a bride price or promise joint tenure on land. Again, these arrangements change by time and place. You might imagine negotiation tables, quill-scratched contracts, and a father or uncle sounding like a medieval CFO. That's not far off. Nobles often held formal negotiations. Who got what rights, how land would pass to heirs, who managed dowry goods if the marriage failed. These were public matters, recorded and witnessed. Personal feelings could matter, but the social ledger often came first. And yet, emotion found spaces. Courtly love, yes, that dramatic, breathless phenomenon you've heard about, thrived in aristocratic circles precisely because the marriage contract rarely allowed the sort of private affection we prize today. Courtly love gave nobles a sanctioned outlet. Elaborate poetry, rituals of admiration, and a theatrical suffering for love. A knight might dedicate a song to a married lady, compose verses about yearning, or perform small symbolic acts, wearing a lady's sash into battle, signing deeds with her name, metaphorically, or carrying tokens that announce devotion without challenging the marriage's political purpose. A couple of things to be clear about courtly love. First, it was highly stylized. Think of it less as a guide for everyday romance and more like membership in an emotional theater club. There were scripts, costumes, and applause. Second, courtly love didn't necessarily lead to physical relationships. That would have been risky and scandalous if it challenged social order, But it did let people express longing, dramatize virtue, and create reputations. Emotional labor had cultural value. Suffering for love was admirable and poetic. That said, sometimes courtly admiration did slip into real-world affairs, and the consequences depended on class, power, and eagerness to punish scandal. For noble women, then, there was this double bind. They were political assets and emotional centers. A lady could be an active patron of poets, compose responses, or, in some cases, thwart family plans to an extent. But most often, choices were constrained by property and status. Peasants and practical partnership. Now change the shot. Mud on the boots. A cart creaks. The conversation is about roofs. Who will mend the plow? Whether the couple's kitchens can support a pig. For peasants, marriage was less diplomacy and more household economics. It was mutual survival. If you could show you could milk a cow or mend a thatch, that was stronger evidence of eligibility than an ornate ring. Practical competence mattered because marriage meant joining two labor pools. Whoever could contribute food, labor, and skills made a better match. Gifts between peasants were functional. A basket of eggs, a carved spoon, a warm cloak. A carved wooden spoon could mean, "I see us sharing porridge." That spoon was domestic, portable, a promise you could feel and use. Dowries existed among peasants too, but they looked different. Sometimes a small flock, a bed, a cow, or a few coins. Village norms and manorial customs shaped the specifics, and those specifics varied a lot by region and by time. But the underlying logic was plain. Marriage was about combining resources to survive the next winter. Courtship in the village happened in work contexts, at the well, during harvest, or while tending animals. A hand graze while passing a pail, a shared joke about the weather. Small physical gestures burned more meaning into everyday life than an elaborate sonnet. Festivals and workside flirtation allowed for glances, tests of competence, can you mend a fence quickly, and negotiated consent in a context where both parties depended on each other. It wasn't private, but it was often more intimate for its mundanity. Nights, performance, and the theater of desire. Back to the manor, nights existed in a world of armor, tournaments, and display. If the noble household was a court, the knight was both actor and audience. He displayed prowess in battle and in poetry, knowing that reputation mattered for social standing. Knights used performative devotion, wearing a lady's favor at a tilt, composing verses, or undertaking quests in her name to build prestige. Courtly love gave knights a script to express longing that did not necessarily threaten feudal obligations. In other words, the knight could publicly adore a lady while the pragmatic business of marriage carried on behind closed doors. This performance had rules. There were lists of do's and don'ts in lyric and prose. One should praise the beloved's virtues, never besmirch her, and often keep devotion secret or coded. Publicly professing a lady as perfect could elevate both speaker and beloved, but it could also inflame jealousies. Theater here is the key word. Courtly love staged desire with gestures, language, and tokens. It's tempting to mock it as mere melodrama, but for participants, the ritualized suffering and praise were meaningful, partly because they showed discipline, restraint, and loyalty, qualities prized in feudal society. Tokens, a medieval inbox. So how did people actually send messages? Here's the medieval inbox. Tokens, objects, carried messages that words sometimes could not. The vocabulary of tokens was rich and socially encoded. Gloves. A glove could declare intimacy. Handing over a glove in a public setting might suggest approval or selection. But gloves were tricky. Given the right context, they could be an intimate exchange. Given the wrong one, they could be evidence of impropriety. In some tales, corrupt or overconfident suitors boasted a lady's glove as trophy, a public claim that could be read as scandalous. Ribbons and sashes. A ribbon tied in a hat or worn on a sleeve boldly signaled favor. Colors mattered, and the location of the token could shape its meaning. Think of a ribbon as a middle ground signal, visible enough to be noticed, ambiguous enough to preserve plausible deniability. Hair. A lock of hair was an intimate gift. It was personal, impossible to fake easily, and it could be kept close, around a neck, woven into a braid, or tucked into a prayer book. Hair as token is striking because it's biological, a literal piece of the giver. That made it powerful, intimate, and sometimes scandalous. Handkerchiefs and cloth. Small scraps of cloth, especially if embroidered, could function as keepsakes. Embroideries sometimes encoded messages, initials, knots, or particular motifs that carried meaning in a circle. Carved spoons. We mentioned the spoon earlier. Among peasants, a carved spoon might function as an everyday pledge. The spoons are domestic, useful, and durable, symbols not of flashy wealth but of shared life. Letters. Yes, letters existed. Not everyone was literate, but letters were a prized medium. They could be penned by scribes, by friends, or by the lovers themselves if they knew how to write. Letters could be sealed, folded, fragranced with herbs and oils, and sometimes smuggled in with other goods. But letters also incurred risks. They could be intercepted by family members, read aloud by clerics, or misdelivered. Remember that most medieval communication was public, monitored, and witnessed. A private note was harder to maintain in a world that prized witness as proof. There are delightful stories, anecdotes that may come to you as legend about misdelivered tokens and mistaken meanings. One such tale, whose precise historical provenance varies by account, indefinito, goes like this in spirit. A letter intended for a secret lover was instead tucked into a salted herring being sent to another household. The letter's reveal led to both scandal and laughter when the herring arrived at an unsuspecting table. Whether that exact story happened in these exact terms or not is hard to pin down, but it illustrates a truth. Tokens could miscarry, and the consequences could be comic, awkward, or catastrophic, depending on status. The social grammar of tokens mattered. Who could give a token and where determined what it meant. A noble handing a shard of ribbon to a commoner had very different connotations than the same gesture exchanged between peers. Tokens were legible to the social circle that had learned the code. They were also risky precisely because their meaning could be contested. A glove claimed in court as proof of intimacy could be used as evidence of impropriety. A ribbon worn too provocatively at festival might attract censure. Tokens were a language, simple objects loaded with context. Surveillance, chaperones, and the church's role. If tokens were the system's private messages, surveillance was the draft, the social architecture that ensured mating had witnesses. Imagine a world where most meaningful events required witnesses, not only to make them legitimate, but sometimes to make them enforceable. Chaperones, extended family, and the local Lord Steward were daily features of courtship. Chaperones. Young people, particularly women, rarely spent time alone with suitors without an overseer. Mothers, elder sisters, kinsmen, or household servants filled the role. These chaperones were not just moral police, they were household managers whose job was to protect property and reputation. Their presence also made courtship public. A stolen conversation under the eaves had to be performed knowing there was often a witness somewhere. Priests and the church. The church had a complex role. On one hand, it sanctified marriage in ritual and moral authority. On the other, ecclesiastical courts sometimes adjudicated disputes over betrothal, dowry, and legitimacy. Clerics preached about chastity and proper conduct. Some even wrote treatises admonishing flirtation as a danger to souls and social order. Monasteries and convents were places where romantic yearning sometimes took clerical form. Monks and nuns composing love-themed poetry, letters smuggled into cloistered spaces, vows broken. Again, exact practices varied by region and century, indefino, but the church's presence shaped the rules and the penalties. Letters intercepted at the church or read during confessions were an especially prickly hazard. A secret note hidden in a prayer book could be discovered by a curious cleric or a nosy relative. The stakes could be practical, a loss of dowry or social standing, or spiritual, with moral censure applied publicly. Surveillance wasn't just about preventing sex before marriage, it was about protecting assets. In many households, virtue and property were two sides of the same coin. Public rituals and the tightrope of mischief. This surveillance led to creativity. If you couldn't meet alone, you staged public moments that let the signal pass. Festivals, fairs, and church gatherings were spaces where norms permitted more contact. Think of the village fair as the closest medieval thing to a singles mixer, but with pumpkins and ale. At festivals, there were sanctioned games and dances, sack races, partner dances, follies, where a brush of a hand could be read as flirtation or nothing at all. These public spaces allowed people to test attraction. A successful joke could signal suitability. A skillful dance could display competence. And a well-timed compliment could create an opening for later negotiation. But that audience meant that scandal could spread fast. A misread gesture could become public gossip by next Sunday's Mass. Because public life was so visible, reputation mattered hugely. A person's value as a match folded in both what they could contribute and how they were spoken about. Gossip, then as now, could make or unmake a match. The medieval rumor mill loved a good scandal, particularly among the nobility, where reputations had political consequences. Elopement, scandal, and the tale of two consequences. Let's talk about rebellion. Sometimes lovers refused to wait for formal negotiations. They ran away.
Elopement could be romantic, two people daring to choose each other against family wishes. Or it could be a desperate act to escape a bad bargain or domestic danger. Elopement worked differently depending on status. A peasant elopement might be tolerated, since peasant households were flexible and often pragmatic. A couple could set up a hearth and start proving their dues by working. Noble elopements were riskier because they threatened alliances and land settlements. A noble elopement could spark years of feud, legal action, or dishonor. The penalties depended on power and leverage. Monastic scandals also pepper the chronicles. Vows broken, secret romances, clandestine pregnancies. These stories attracted attention because they combined spiritual stake and public curiosity. Where the church had authority, scandal mattered. Widowhood, remarriage, and the strange freedom of loss. One surprising secret is widowhood's relative autonomy. Yes, a widow faced grief and economic uncertainty, but in many cases she also gained new legal leverage. Widows sometimes administered property, managed estates, and negotiated remarriage on their own terms, especially if they had children or a dower, a legally recognized share of her deceased husband's estate. For many women, widowhood offered degrees of independence unavailable to married women bound under their husband's household. This autonomy could translate into bargaining power in subsequent matches. Again, the shape of this power depended on region and law, but the pattern recurs in many accounts. Emotional realities, quiet affection, survival-based partnerships, and rebellion. Let's pull back from tokens, laws, and scandals to the human level. Medieval romances were not all sonnets or bargains. They included quiet mornings making porridge together, hands raw from shared work, small kindnesses that formed durable bonds. For peasants, affection often grew from shared labor. For nobles, affection sometimes took the form of intellectual companionship, patronage, or correspondences. People did love each other. They mourned. They longed. But the emotional register and the language differed. Where we might talk of dating as a private exploratory stage, medieval courtship frequently treated desire as a public, material expression. That difference didn't erase tenderness. It reshaped how tenderness was performed, witnessed, and preserved. The case of the misplaced glove, a short scene.
Allow a brief imagined vignette to put a human face on this grammar of tokens. It's mid-afternoon in a market town. Sir Rowan, dusty from a raid long past, has a saffron sash knotted at his wrist, Lady Aelina's color. He hasn't spoken to her in person for weeks because her family is negotiating another match. At the market, he tries to hand a glove to his squire to return to her household via a mutual acquaintance. The glove slips into the wrong basket, and a brewer's daughter, thinking it a pretty trinket, tucks it in her apron. News travels. A glove lost, a glove found. Who did it belong to? Aelina's family sees the glove on a passerby and assumes impropriety. Gossip spins. The brewers, amused, sell ale with the story attached, and suddenly a simple token becomes evidence, rumor, and commerce. This vignette is fiction, composed to illustrate how tokens could be misdelivered and misread, but its logic fits many documented behaviors. Objects moved in messy networks. Social meaning was always in danger of being rearranged by chance. Letters, secrecy, and the risk of reading aloud. Back to letters for a moment. The act of writing a letter was itself a statement. If you could write, you performed status. If you couldn't, hiring a scribe exposed you to risk. Someone else knew your words. Once written, a letter could be sealed with wax, scented with oil, or embedded in commonplace goods. But sending a letter often meant trusting a network of deliverers, servants, traders, monks. Interception was common enough to make secret correspondences hazardous. Sometimes clerics read letters. Sometimes a bored maid read them aloud to a household, or used them as fuel for gossip. That risk made coded language popular. Lovers used metaphors, biblical allusions, or mundane details to disguise affection. A description of weather might hide longing. A recipe might be a map to a rendezvous. These codes required sophistication and trust. Tokens revisited. Objects as legally charged evidence. Tokens could serve legal functions. A glove or a ribbon found with a suitor might be introduced as evidence in a dispute over honor, dowry, or paternity. That's why families collected witnesses, documented exchanges, and sometimes demanded that tokens be returned at marriage settlements. The same object that once expressed affection could later be weaponized as proof of impropriety. That double life of objects, love token and legal deposit, made tokens powerful and dangerous. We can already see a pattern. Medieval courtship was not purely romantic or purely strategic. It was a hybrid ecosystem where love and law, affection and assets, poetry and performance coexisted, sometimes uneasily. A tension that keeps turning. At this point, you might be thinking, that's a lot of rules and not a lot of privacy. You'd be right. But rules created arenas for creativity. Courtly rituals allowed love to be expressed in verse. Tokens allowed affection to be encoded into objects. Festivals allowed flirtation under supervision. And where the rules suffocated, some people found ways to break them. Elopements, secret letters, or simply living affectionately within the constraints they had. We're warming up toward the dramatic bits, the dances, the elopements, the legal fights over dowry, and the rituals that could make or break a match. Tokens, then, were partly public signals and partly personal resistances. A ribbon tied to a harp might be seen by a few eyes, but understood by the lovers as a vow. A carved spoon hidden beneath a mattress might be a private pact. This back and forth, public and private, legal and intimate, defines the surprisingly complex ecology of medieval dating. A moment of crisis. To end this segment, consider a nearly documented type of crisis, a misread token leading to a betrothal dispute. In the story we've sketched, Sir Rowan's misdelivered glove becomes a problem when Lady Aelina's family interprets it as evidence of clandestine meetings. They accelerate negotiations with a different suitor to protect honor. Sir Rowan, whose family is less politically powerful, is faced with either protesting through legal or ecclesiastical channels, costly and uncertain, or attempting an elopement, risky for nobles. On the peasant level, a misdelivered spoon could simply change whom a village accepts as a partner. Consequences are social but often survivable. But the emotional fallout is similar. A mismatch between private desire and the public ledger can create fractures that are not easily repaired. That tension between private feelings and public commitments is the engine of many medieval stories. It powers poetry, fuels elopements, and makes tokens dangerous objects. It also produces surprising creativity, coded messages, ingenious rendezvous, and the very institution of courtly love that allowed emotional expression at arm's length from political decision-making. We'll pick up from here. Festivals where those rendezvous could be staged, the formal mechanics of marriage ceremonies and annulments, and the dramatic arcs of elopements and widowhood that show how individuals sometimes reshaped rules to make life livable. But before that, notice how often material culture enters the plot. Gloves, ribbons, spoons, ledgers. Objects are not background, they are protagonists. Next, we'll watch a festival where a brief touch on a partner's sleeve means more than a like on social media. We'll see how dances worked as courtship scaffolding and how a single public gesture could seal a rumor or start a romance. Then we'll return to legal realities, how marriages were formalized and why undoing them was so hard for ordinary people. And finally, we'll trace a real-turned-legendary elopement to see what risk and romance looked like when people chose to defy the ledger. If you want to keep exploring, stick with me. The next section gets livelier. Music, smell, the press of a crowd, and a scandal that refuses to stay quiet. The market scene's gossip outlives the glove. Rumors fanned like embers. Who had found the glove? Who had seen it? Who had joked about it over ale? Lady Eilena's family tightened meetings. Offers were measured in ledger lines, and vows whispered behind curtains. Sir Rowan, who had meant only to slip a token and keep his honor intact, suddenly found himself up against a problem that had as much to do with inked accounts as with the flutter in his chest. In a world where a lost glove could be read as a public claim, reputation was currency, and reputation could be spent, invested, and ruined. Now, imagine the opposite kind of scramble, the village fair. The bells ring early. The air is sweaty with ale, wood smoke, and roasting meat. Children weave between legs while minstrels pluck strings. The fair is a compressed world where the rules bend. A young peasant woman named Brenna tightens her apron and eyes the sack race with a calculating grin. She needs a man who can carry a harvest and steady a roof. She looks for strength, yes, but also wit. Alric, broad-shouldered with a laugh like a cleaver hitting bone, wobbles into the sack and falls over spectacularly. Brenna laughs, helps him up, and in that laughter they test each other's humor, eyes, and patience. The sack race is followed by a dance, in which a slipped hand becomes promise, not scandal. The village watches, judges competence, and then moves on. If Brenna and Alric decide that their skills mesh, the village accepts them, because the household economy can absorb the match. For peasants, community approval and practical fit matter more than lineage papers. Festivals were where people rehearsed the possibilities that the ledger might not list. Maying, harvest feasts, saints' days, each offered rituals designed to be watched. Dances were not anonymous. They were audition stages. A performer could show courage by stepping forward to lead a dance, skill by mastering a tune, or tenderness by swapping a ribbon at the right moment. There were prescribed games, blindfold dances, partner-changing rounds, competitive feats that created socially sanctioned intimacy. A flirtatious collision at the harvest game was less a private trespass than a public test. Can you handle this partner? Laugh with them? Sweep mud off their cloak? People learned each other's virtues not in whispered DMs, but in how they steadied the plow or how they kept the hearth's fire through winter. And yet, even in these public spaces, misread gestures could become reputations. A flirtation that led to a scandal could follow someone for years. If, at the fair, a woman accepted a ribbon from a man of dubious repute, gossip could harden the thread into suspicion. So festivals were both permission and peril, liberation trimmed by communal watchfulness. Back in noble halls, however, the choreography was more elaborate. Courts staged tournaments, masks, and poetic contests, where tokens and favors turned into public theater. A knight wearing a lady's colors into a tournament made a visible claim: admiration, allegiance, and, crucially, reputation. A lady who accepted such a favor displayed refined taste, but also opened herself to scrutiny.
The court was a theater with many critics, fellow lords, jealous suitors, and political rivals. A poem read aloud could win applause and enemies. Courtly love fed on that risk. The emotional performance heightened status as much as sentiment. Now move from festival lights to the hush of the church and the formal choreography of the marriage itself. The ceremony was the legal seal on what might previously have been a negotiation, a festival flirtation, or an arranged betrothal. In many places, bans, announcements of intent to marry, were read aloud in church on consecutive Sundays to allow for objections and to make the union public. That public ritual is one reason tokens took on such weight. The community's witness was a kind of social insurance. Marriage formalities could be simple, a spoken consent before witnesses, or they could involve complex transactions: dowry inventories, lands being assigned, and steward-led agreements. The dowry, in many regions, provided for the woman's household and sometimes guaranteed support if the marriage failed. The groom's family might contribute lands or a bride price. But legal specifics varied considerably across time and place. So whenever we say dowry or bride price had a certain effect, read that as, in many contexts, this often functioned like, rather than universal law. Annulments, meanwhile, were hard to come by. The church could grant them on specific grounds: lack of consent, consanguinity, being too closely related, according to canonical degrees, impotence, ordained vows, or a pre-existing valid marriage, among other causes. But the burden of proof was high, the process slow, and outcomes depended on influence, wealth, and the local ecclesiastical officials' willingness to intervene. For nobles, an annulment could be a political tool. Kings and lords sometimes pushed for dissolutions to arrange new alliances. For commoners, the process might be out of reach economically or socially. So marriage, once formalized, tended to be sticky. Consider Edburga at the manor table, watching ink transform linens into lifetime obligations. If she, or someone like her, decided to challenge a match, she faced multiple hurdles: convincing witnesses, finding an ecclesiastical patron, or proving to technical impediment. Where annulments were available, they sometimes redistributed property. Dowries could be returned, portions reassigned, and reputations negotiated into new titles. But the human cost, shame, ostracism, and the emotional damage was often irreducible. Which brings us to the story that most people remember: the elopement. Not as a single kind of event, but as a cluster of desperate acts with wildly different outcomes depending on who ran and where. For peasants, eloping could be an act of mutual agreement and swift household formation. Two people literally moved their hearth together and proved their viability to the village. For nobles, eloping could be a declaration of war. Let's track Sir Rowan's choices. Once the glove is misdelivered, Ailina's family accelerates a betrothal with a more politically advantageous house. Sir Rowan has options: protest through the steward and legal channels, accept and hope the garden of his heart heals, or attempt a dramatic rescue. He chooses the dramatic route: a planned meeting at Vespers with Ailina and two faithful men. They arrange a horse, a sealed letter, and a short route across hedged fields. The elopement scene is cinematic: cloaks in the moonlight, a horse's breath steaming in cold air, a dog barking in the distance. For a moment, it feels like the poetry of courtly love has reached physical form. They ride.
The news travels slower in the countryside than rumor at the market, but it travels all the same. When the family discovers the empty bed and the overturned letter, rage follows. Legal letters fly between lords. Eilena's family accuses Sir Rowan of kidnapping, while his defenders frame it as mutual consent, a man defending his honor and a woman asserting her will. Ecclesiastical courts are petitioned, vassals take sides, and banners shift on the hilltops. The elopement becomes a matter of public interest and political negotiation. Negotiators arrive not to ask about feelings, but to calculate restitution. Which lands will compensate which grievances? Will a dowry be returned, renegotiated, or forfeited? Can the couple be legitimized without humiliation? These are the practical questions that follow the romance. Sometimes compromise wins. Families agree to a mediated settlement. Sir Rowan pays fines or transfers a modest holding. Eilena's dowry is formally recognized to prevent contestation of heirs. A public ceremony follows to remove the stain of scandal. In other cases, vengeance hardens. Feuds can last generations. The way the story ends, historically, depends on power and luck, fortunes, alliances, and sometimes a sympathetic bishop who sees stability in marriage. This is why the same elopement narrative can become a heroic ballad in one region and a cautionary chronicle in another. What about the most dramatic of rebellions, when lovers entered the cloister? Monastic settings offered another kind of paradox. Cloisters were intended to remove sexual desire from life, yet they also concentrated longing. Monks and nuns sometimes penned poetry, courted patrons, or exchanged letters with the outside world. A clandestine relationship within monastic walls combined spiritual transgression with scandalous spectacle. If discovered, it threatened not only reputations, but the church's moral authority. Punishments varied: public penances, exile, or, in extreme cases, corporal punishment. But the narrative of clerical love has a persistent allure in chronicles because it blends spiritual conflict with palpable human desire. We must also return to tokens at this moment because tokens could be used as evidence in these disputes. A glove dropped at a monastery gate, a ribbon found torn in a confessional, a letter hidden in a psalter. These items could be quarried as proof. Families who wanted to press a claim might point to a found token as a material trace of impropriety. Conversely, tokens could be reclaimed as proof of commitment. That double usage, symbol of love and piece of evidence, gives tokens their dramatic power. An object that once promised porridge could later be cited in court. Which brings us to a surprisingly modern mechanism, the public verification of relationships. In many communities, the act of publicly reading bans or recording a marriage served to prevent future disputes over legitimacy and inheritance. Much like posting on social media stabilizes a relationship today, public acknowledgement creates social ramifications. So did the medieval public announcement function to lock in agreements. The parallel is tempting. Tokens are like texts, but beware the trap of literal equivalence. A ribbon tied on a sleeve is not a DM. It's a material object that other people can see, touch, and ultimately use as evidence. The analogy helps us imagine, not to conflate. Widowhood deserves a long, tender look because it often rewrote the rules. Meet Agnes, a woman who becomes a widow in her 30s. Her husband dies, leaving behind fields, a cottage, and children. In the immediate aftermath, sorrow is raw and cupboards empty. But in many contexts, widows stepped into managerial roles, collecting rents, overseeing harvests, negotiating with tenants, and defending dower rights. If Agnes had a dower, an assigned portion of her husband's lands for her lifetime, she could command resources. In practice, widowhood could make a woman more visible in local politics and more capable of negotiating a new match on her terms. For some women, remarrying quickly was a pragmatic choice. For others, widowhood offered a period of autonomy and negotiation, time to decide whether a second marriage would be economically and emotionally desirable. Widows sometimes remarried for security, but they could also leverage their household's immediate economic need to secure favorable terms. protection for children, the retention of dower, or agreements to keep certain lands in the family. In high-status contexts, widows wielded influence. Queen's regent are a high-profile example, and even at village level, a capable widow could be a force in communal decisions. This dimension complicates any monolithic picture of medieval women as uniformly powerless. Agency existed, but it was uneven and heavily constrained by property, law, and social expectations. Superstitions and compatibility checks add a final color wash to this portrait. The medieval mind did not treat marriage as purely contractual. It was also cosmological. People consulted astrologers, looked for omens, and paid attention to signs in births or dreams. A family might seek an auspicious day for betrothal, or ask a local healer about fertility prospects. Astrological charts could guide timing, and in some courts, noble planners genuinely believed that the heavens affected mortal affairs. That belief was both comfort and constraint. If the astrologer warned about a particular pairing, families listened. There were also practical checks, parish priests asking about kinship, examinations for visible signs of health. How literal those checks were depends on record and place, and gossip-based vetting. Kinship rules governed marriageability. Too close a blood relation could be forbidden under canon law, and sometimes parties would present genealogies to clear a match. These genealogies could be manipulated. A new branch might be emphasized, or a distant ancestor erased to make a union permissible. In that sense, family trees were pragmatic tools, not merely historical records. At this point, we can sketch a final drama that threads together tokens, festivals, elopements, legal struggles, and human feeling. One more vignette to crystallize the stakes. We'll follow two parallel arcs, the noble scandal and the peasant courtship that quietly becomes a durable partnership. Sir Rowan and Lady Alina's tale continues in public. The elopement has become fodder for poets and enemies. Negotiations go poorly at first. Alina's kin demand restitution and insist on legal condemnation. Sir Rowan's family countermands and accuses Alina's family of overreaching. A bishop intervenes, not to pass moral judgment on their love, but to stabilize the region. Feuding nobles could disrupt tithes, rents, and peasant livelihoods. The bishop proposes a mediated settlement, a public ceremony to legitimize marriage, an arranged transfer of minor property to Alina to secure her future children, and a mutual restitution that keeps both houses from the brink. They sign. The public ceremony is slow and somber. Ink, witnesses, the bishop's hand. And the couple is married fully in church. The romance survives, but not without cost. Reputations are yellowed, relationships among kin are cool. The ledger now lists a fine against Sir Rowan. Their story becomes a ballad, thrilling, risky, and ultimately domesticated by settlement. Brenna and Alric, the peasants, choose a different risk. When villagers whisper about their affection, the couple acts within communal norms. They announce their intention in the market, they agree to work for both sets of households for a season to prove competence, and they give a carved spoon, made by Alric, to Brenna as a domestic pledge. The villagers watch them, and, seeing the couple's usefulness and goodwill, accept their match. The spoon hangs in their cottage, and over years its wood absorbs the smell of porridge and the scars of being used. Their partnership matures into mutual reliance in a way that poetry does not, but which is no less profound. Where Sir Rowan and Alina's love was theatrical and politically entangled, Brenna and Ulric's was quiet, practical, and durable. Both trajectories are true to types found in the medieval record: a noble elopement narrated with drama, a peasant match built from everyday competence. Both show how love and marriage in the Middle Ages mingled material needs with emotional life. The surprising secret, again, is the hybridity. Courtship was at once romantic, transactional, public, and deeply human. So where does this leave us as modern observers who text, swipe, and agonize over the little blue ticks of attention? First, the useful analogies. Tokens are a kind of medieval text. They communicate, they can be intercepted, and they can be used as evidence. Festivals functioned as organized social mixers. Bans worked like public verification, making a union a community matter. But, and this is important, these are analogies, not equivalences. The medieval context had materiality and legal frameworks that made tokens literal objects with legal consequences, not ephemeral digital notes. Privacy was rarer. Publicness was built into ritual. The stakes included property and hereditary claims in ways that many modern dating situations do not. Another modern echo, the omnipresent surveillance of reputation, resonates with our era of social media. Yet the medieval surveillance was often enacted by trusted kin networks whose motives were survival as much as morality. That blend of social protection and control is a human constant. Communities regulate mating because the consequences, food, shelter, children, matter to more than the two people involved. There's also a loss and a gain. We've gained privacy and choice in many parts of the world. We've lost rituals that made commitments public and ceremonial. For some, the medieval practice of formalizing intent felt weighty in a way that made promises stick. For others, it was stifling. If you could import one medieval dating rule into 2025, would you pick formalized public commitment to strengthen promises? Or the communal care that made people's reputations easier to verify? Or the poetry of courtly gestures that made language of desire elegant and precise? Drop your pick below. The surprising secrets we've seen are not blueprints to resurrect, but they might contain a charm or two worth stealing. Before we close, let's return to the tokens one last time. Imagine an object's life, carved from a tree, whittled by hand into a spoon, adopted as a household pledge, used daily until polished by porridge and time, displayed when children visit as proof of an old union. Across generations, that spoon carries memory, not just of affection, but of survival. Compare that to a verse from a courtly love lyric. Short lines, devotion framed in metaphor. I die as often as I breathe. A phrase not to be taken literally, but to signify an artful suffering. Both objects and words became cultural means to express longing. Together, they created a medieval grammar of love that was robust and varied. Finally, a note on sources and uncertainty. Many of the practices described, bans read in church, dowries of linen or livestock, bans, tokens as favored gifts, show up across numerous accounts. But local laws and customs varied greatly across centuries and regions. Where I've sketched legal processes or typical practices, those are general patterns rather than universal rules. If you're planning to pursue this topic for research or reenactment, consider consulting local historiography or museum sources for specific regions and periods. To close, dating in the Middle Ages was not the absence of feeling. It was a different grammar of feeling: public, material, theatrical, and practical. It tied bodies and hearts into a social fabric thicker than our private inboxes, and it created arenas, festivals, courts, marriages, where the personal and political braided together. Sometimes that braid sheltered tenderness, sometimes it tightened into constraint. The surprising secret is that, despite all the ledger lines and dowries, people still found ways to laugh, to touch, to carve a spoon for someone else, and to steal away in the moonlight if they chose. Those gestures testify to a universal human desire, to be known, to be chosen, and to find a way to make a life together. Which of those medieval rules would you keep? The public accountability of chaperones? The ceremonial gravity of betrothals? The poetic courtship of knights? Or the practical test of a sack race? Tell us in the comments. City, country, or your best medieval alias. If you enjoyed this deep dive into awkward gloves, carved spoons, and wedding ledgers, there's more. Watch our next video on How Festivals Saved Romance for a closer look at the dances, games, and rituals that let people flirt with witnesses and hang a ribbon without risk, or with just the right kind of risk. And for a final thought, your modern dating app might ping you one more time this week. Imagine getting that notification in a world where a priest might read your note aloud and your dowry is on the table. Somehow, that almost makes your awkward first date feel a little less lonely and a lot less like being tried in public for the crime of falling in love. If this story sparked your curiosity, like, share, and dive into the comments. Tell us which medieval dating secret you'd want to try. We'll be back with more strange histories that make the past feel oddly familiar.